Reaccion Environment Assembly in Nairobi. My name is Patricia. I'm from the European Environmental Bureau, and I'm very pleased to welcome you in the name of all the co-organizers of this event, the EB, together with Global Witness, Earth Justice, the Center for International Environmental Law, CIEL, Earthworks, Reaccion Climatica from Bolivia, the PHE Consortium from Ethiopia, Norwegian Forum for Environment and Development, the NGO Major Group, and the Women's Major Group. So thank you all for joining us here today on the first day of UNEA. In the last decade, more than 1,000 environmental defenders were killed, and many, many more had to suffer from violent threats, defamation, strategic lawsuits against public participation, SLAPs, the violation of their basic environmental rights, the right to information, the right to public participation and access to justice in environmental matters, the cutting of their funds, and many other things. So we are here today to commemorate all those who have lost their lives and those who have suffered from such threats, to show our solidarity and to support those defenders who on a daily basis are seeking to protect our planet and our health. What we want to do is to discuss what is needed to better protect them so they can exercise their rights freely and do their work safely. While environmental defenders or the situation of environmental defenders has received some attention some years ago, I'm afraid that we have become too used to the fact that environmental defenders are not only harassed and threatened, but killed in rising numbers every year. So we're here to make sure that UNEA cannot remain silent on this issue. The topic has not made it on the agenda of member states, but we're here to make sure that they are not forgotten. So today's event is a hybrid event. We are here at the UN compound at the UN Environment Program in Nairobi with friends here in the room, while many of you are joining us online. So as participants, you have access to the chat. So if you have questions, comments, something that you would like to share with us during the event, feel free to drop us a message in the chat, and I'll try to pick up the information, the questions, the comments that you're sharing with us. And maybe we have a little bit of time at the end to also take questions from the floor. That depends on how long we need. So please use the chat and share your thoughts with us. You can also, of course, share your thoughts through social media. You can use the hashtag environmental defenders, and you can tag the co-organizers so we can follow you and share your comments as well. So without further delay, let us go to our speakers. I will first give the floor to our colleague Jago Wadley. He's a senior campaigner with Global Witness. And as many of you know, Global Witness has done a tremendously important job in documenting the threats and the violence against environmental defenders. So Jago is going to share some information from Global Witness's last report. Jago, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen and bring up my presentation, if I may. Yeah, so my name's Jago Wadley. I'm a senior campaigner at Global Witness, and I'm just going to present the findings of our recent annual report on the killings of land and environmental defenders. So land and environmental defenders are people who take a stand against corrupt, discriminatory, or damaging exploitation of natural resources and the environment. Our definition covers a broad range of people, including communities who are affected by projects, whether it be mining, logging, agribusiness, and so on. They could be wildlife or biodiversity protectors and park rangers, or civil society organizations, lawyers, journalists, and politicians. So we have quite a broad range of stakeholders who can become or be environmental defenders. The background to our reports, Global Witnesses works to raise awareness on attacks against environmental and land defenders. We are trying to bring about consumer market regulatory reform to increase due diligence of companies. That has focused also recently on the agri sector, which is a major driver of harms against land and environmental defenders. And obviously we look to learn from and try and empower and raise the voice of groups working on these issues globally, many of whom are instrumental in our research leading to these reports. And our campaign, we do research, investigations, publish exposés and write policy and briefing documents. These annual reports on killings we do each year. This 2020 was our 9th report since 2012. This year we will be producing a 10th report. And we've also recently done some reports on agri-sector harms linked to the palm oil and soy industries. So the 2020 report, which we published in September last year, was called Last Line of Defense. And these are some of the headline findings from that report. We found that 227 LEDs, land and environmental defenders, had been killed during 2020, although unfortunately that increased to 228 because one of the people who had been missing was later found to have died after we published the report. It is for the second consecutive year the highest number ever in our data set, representing a general rise over the last 10 years. And over a third of the victims we found were indigenous people, despite representing only 5% of the world's population. And as well, indigenous people we found were the target of 5 of the 7 mass killing events that we recorded in 2020. Unfortunately, almost 3 in 4 of the attacks that we recorded, the lethal attacks, occurred in the Americas, with over half of those in just 3 countries, which I'll mention in a minute. 28 of the victims last year were state officials or park rangers. And on average, there were 4 killed per week in 2020, but also every week since the 2015 Paris Climate Accord was signed, which is a worrying signal given the increasing importance of land and environmental defenders in trying to oppose projects or land uses that are driving climate change. So these are the key jurisdictions. The highest country, the country with the most amount of killings was Colombia with 65. And again, in Colombia, a third of these killings were against indigenous people. Almost half of them were against small-scale farmers. And 17 of those killings were connected to the cocoa crop substitution schemes, where farmers were seeking to move out of cocoa production as part of an agreement under the 2016 Peace Accord, and were killed when trying to get out of cocaine production. The majority of killings took place in countries that have limited civic freedoms, of course. So the vast majority were in countries that civicists describe as countries with limited civic freedoms. The next highest category were those countries where those freedoms are obstructed. I would note that killings in countries that are classified as closed civic spaces are likely to be significantly underreported. So these are countries where there is limits on press freedom, demonstration, and generally representation of people in decision making. There are also countries that feature very highly on a per capita basis, which may not be in the top 3 or 4 countries overall, but Nicaragua had the highest per capita killings rate last year, followed by Honduras, Colombia, then Guatemala and the Philippines. But those 3 countries, Colombia, Mexico, and the Philippines, made up over half of the killings that we recorded in our data set last year. And then looking at the sectors involved, the types of industry drivers that are linked to these conflicts that result in killings, over a third of them last year were of attacks were linked to resource exploitation. Logging was the sector with the most cases, where we registered 23 cases in 2020. Agribusiness and mining were each linked to 17 cases. And since 2015, these two sectors have been linked to over 30% of all the killings that we and our partners have recorded. And again, just to mention, 17 cases linked to illegal crop substitution. And these would have helped Colombia feature as the highest, the most lethal country in 2020 in our data set. Just to talk through a couple of cases which we featured in the report. This is the case of Fikile Nishingase in South Africa, who was assassinated on the 22nd of October 2020. She was shot inside her house by 3 gunmen while her grandson waited outside. She had been opposing the expansion of a coal mine that had affected her community, and had been trying to remove members of the community through incentive schemes, many of the community members resisted this, including Fikile, and it is believed that that contributed to the reasons for her murder. And Fikile is survived by her daughter and grandson, who remain in the family home and who are still involved in opposing the expansion of the mine concerned. Another case we featured was that of Oscar Ayraud Adams, who is a Kumeyaay indigenous water activist in Mexico. He was assassinated on the 24th of September 2020, and he was chased down and shot by multiple assassins in 2 vehicles. And Oscar had been campaigning for access to scarce water resources in the Baja California region of Mexico. His community had suffered restricted access to water, had struggled to grow local crops for themselves, whilst major brewery operations in the region had been offered permits, giving them millions of cubic meters of water allocations. And it is understood that these water permits exacerbated the limits on water availability for his community, and had been driving the sort of water-based resource conflict that he was campaigning on. We also took the opportunity last year to consolidate some of the data that we've aggregated over the last 10 years, or 9 years in this case. So we published all of the data that can be downloaded on our website, and covering 1,540 land and environmental defenders that we've recorded having been killed since 2012. There's a general rise over time, although that is subject to data constraints. And again, we show the different sectors that have been involved or positively linked to these killings over time across that 9-year data set. So again, mining and extractives contributed to about 286 cases, followed by agribusiness linked to about 150, and then logging, water and dams, hydropower projects, and also then poaching and things like that. And you can see that a large majority of cases we haven't managed to link to specific sectors, and that's not necessarily because there isn't a sector, it's because of the limits on the reporting and the data availability that we were able to verify. So we were unable to verify which specific industry was involved in many cases, but we believe that that's not evidence that these were not linked to, you know, projects, resources, corporate activities, and so on. I think it's just the fact of the limits of the data available to us. This is the killings since 2012 geographically by country. So Brazil has produced the most killings in our data over time at about 317, followed by Colombia 290, and then the Philippines at 250. And you can see other countries, particularly in Latin America, but also in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and also India featuring very highly over that 12-year period. 9-year period. And we'll be making this sort of data available like this from now on an annual, but also on an aggregate level, since we've been doing these reports. In terms of recommendations, the report, I haven't put them all in there, but obviously these killings need to be dramatically reduced in key countries, particularly in Latin America, and particularly those affecting indigenous people who, as I mentioned, make up 5% of the global population, but are the subject of over a third of all fatal attacks in our data set. We've been calling on for human rights supply chain due diligence legislation in various countries, but particularly in the European Union. And I'm pleased to announce that the European Commission did table a proposal on mandatory human rights due diligence for corporates operating in Europe. We would like to see that rolled out more broadly, perhaps through a UN binding treaty on human rights that would require parties to establish similar legislation within their jurisdictions. We'd also like to see key sectors like agri-commodity traders who are the nexus between the market and supply of products that cover vast swathes of land, affecting land and environmental defenders. We'd like them to significantly improve their human rights and environment due diligence. We're keen to ensure that offsets and nature-based solutions that are increasingly being proposed as solutions to climate change do not present new threats as these slightly uncertain solutions are rolled out in response to commitments to mitigate climate change. And we also want climate defenders and indigenous peoples to have a significant influence in forming and upholding coherent global climate change mitigation regimes, including through much more secure award of land rights to not just indigenous people, but also local communities who are resisting many of the industries that are driving the climate crisis. So that's more or less a summary of the report. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jago, for sharing your research. That was, I think, extremely informative and giving us the background information to continue the discussion about the solutions that we need. Let me now give the floor to Carmen Capriles. Carmen is from the Women's Major Group, one of the co-organizers of our event today. She's an environmental activist with Reaccion Climatica in Bolivia, and she's going to speak about the situation in Latin America. Over to you, Carmen.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I use this microphone? Well, thank you, Patricia, for the invitation and for the opening remarks. I would like to talk a little bit about the challenges that America Latina has when we speak about nature and environmental and human rights defenders. I wanted to show a presentation, but yeah, most of my data is also from Global Witness. So thank you, Diego, for that presentation. Don't wanna go all over it again, but I think it's important to recall that Latin America is one of the deadliest regions for environmental activists. And that comes as a surprise for many people, because most people would think that one of the deadliest zones could be some other place in the planet, not Latin America, where everything is peace and love, right? But no, the situation is that Latin America is facing great threats because right now there is a demand for a number of natural resources. Many of them, for example, are minerals. The other driver of environmental persecution or killing is not only the issues related to mining, also the issues related to illegal logging, issues related to dams, mega projects. Anybody who wants to oppose to a highway, especially when this is done in indigenous territory or in indigenous land. So those are things that have to be taken into account, although countries, and especially like mine, I come from Bolivia, where the consultation process to the indigenous populations are mandatory or are binding. The consultation process has been really lowered to decrease a lot in terms of application. So and it is within the Constitution. So one thing is that we have the ESCAS agreement, which was adopted on 2018 around access to information, access to participation, and access to justice on environmental issues, basically what is Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration of 1992. And furthermore, it includes issues like environmental and human rights defenders. It includes vulnerable populations, all those populations that cannot access the legal system that most of us know. And basically, most of them are either indigenous people or local communities. And those are the kinds of populations that we are watching that are suffering the greatest threat, because in their territories, all these mega projects are going to happening or are happening. And there is the thing in the region with this Caso agreement looks very promising. And we really hope that this tendency of the killing of environmental activists is going to turn around. But what is the reality that we are seeing is that many countries just have signed it. Many countries have not ratified it yet. There isn't a proper legislation, and some countries want to get a hold on of the ESCAS agreement and start dictating who is going to be the defensor and who's not. And that is a great threat for civil society, because civil society has to be in the means to be able to be an environmental and human rights defenders on their own right, and not with a mandate from any government. So it's one of the big challenges that we're facing in the region, that these issues don't become national issues, and that we really can strengthen civil society to stop the trend of the killing of the activists, but at the same time, making the voices of indigenous people, of local communities, of people in the cities that are against a mega project, that are against logging, that are against mining, or against of any.
Thank you so much, Carmen, for your contribution. We have some comments and some questions. So there's a colleague from Mexico who is saying that indeed this is the situation they're facing as activists, as journalists, just when they're expressing or when they're exercising their human rights to the freedom of expression. So thank you for that comment. And there's two other questions in the chat about the situation in Brazil. Maybe our colleague Jago can give an answer to Ludmila in the chat if that's possible for you. So let me see if our next guest is in the room. Yes, he is. So we have with us now an environmental activist, an environmental defender from Sweden, Jonas Vanar. Jona is from the Sami community, an indigenous group living in Scandinavia, northern Scandinavia, who have been fighting for their rights to exercise their traditional lifestyle as reindeer herders. So Jonas is going to share with us about the situation being an environmental defender in that circumstance. So Jonas, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I will try to share my screen here. So. Can you see that? Okay, thank you much. Northern Sweden, land of the Sami. In fact, I'm based just north of the Arctic Circle, So here is still winter. Here's on the map, so you can orientate yourself. So it's just north of the Arctic Circle in northern Sweden. And actually, the Sami area is virtually half of Sweden. It's also better part of Norway, northern part of Finland, and in the Kola Peninsula. So this is my area, my where I'm based and where I heard. And what are the Sami? The Sami is a minority in Sweden, and we are considered the only indigenous people in Europe. Sweden declared in 2010 that the Sami is a nation within Sweden. The Sami is the definition in Sweden is that I mean they made a proposition and they've put it in the Swedish law in 2010, and with that recognition, I mean the Sami has been around for at least 1,000 years, but only in 2010 Sweden recognized us as indigenous people, and with that came the international declarations. For example, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People came in fact, and these are treaties that Sweden have signed, but Sweden have not signed the ILO 169 treaty, which is signed by Norway, which gives us certain rights to Sami land. So the struggle for the Sami, and Sami are of course also Swedish citizens and Norwegian citizens and Finnish citizens or so on. And what's the definition of indigenous? I mean, you know this, but it's interesting in Sweden because Sweden formed around 500 years ago, and the Sami were already in Sweden at that time. In some cases, even more widespread than now. And Sami, we have a need for special regulations because of our special use of land. We are herders, but we're also some populations have been fishermen, and but reindeer herding is really what our culture is mostly based on. And around 500 years ago, when Sweden was formed, the king actually recognized the Sami as the owner of their land. In fact, the Sami had to pay tax for these lands. But what happened later is that Sweden...
Excuse me, Jonas, the presentation is not moving. I only see the first one.
Okay. I can't really help that. I'm sorry about that. I didn't realize that. See if it's. Can you see it now?
Yes. Now I see. I think the second one, or I see Ufc Indigenous. What we want. The Sami. Yeah. Now it's moving. Jonas, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I'll keep it in this view. So the king in Sweden recognized the Sami rights, and later around 200 years ago, or 100 years, 150 years ago, Sweden realized that they could mine ore, they could cut down the trees, and they could dam the rivers. They could make money from the Sami areas. So they changed the writings in text from owning to a right to utilize the area. And this meant for Sami culture, you can't own land anyway, so it wasn't really a difference other than you weren't needed to pay tax anymore. So the king basically said, yeah, do you want to not pay tax? Yeah, sure. And what's the difference? There's no difference. You can herd the reindeers in the same way as you used to, but and now a couple of 100 years later, it's made all the difference, because we don't own our land. We only have the right to herd our reindeers there. I mean, the Sami is, I mean, we're not killed, not directly at least by the state, but we have struggle nonetheless. So I mean, personally, my ultimate goal is to have some sort of self-determination in the northern areas. If that's not possible, at least a right to decide when it comes to exploitations and natural resources within our area. In that sense, also FPIC is a way to go forward. And the last point, kind of where we actually are today, we have a right to be consulted. We have, in some instances, a right to negotiate, but the right to be consulted is more or less, in some cases, warning. We're going to run you over, and now you know we're going to do it. So, you're welcome. And if you look at this map, you see the Sami area is virtually half of Sweden. And then people say that are not Sami, yeah, but are you going to hinder half of Sweden from development? No, that's not the case. In half of Sweden, there is competing land use. In half of Sweden, we have a lot of mining. 93% of Europe's iron ore comes from these areas. There's extensive forestry. There's hydropower. The bulk of Sweden's electric power comes from these areas. There's a lot of wind power. And wind power is clean energy, but nobody wants to be neighbors to a wind power plant. So that's why today Sweden are building wind power where less people live, and that's our area. The railroads and infrastructure. So all these, and there are a lot of big cities in the Sami area, and all these things are in this half of Sweden. So we're not alone. We're actually a minority. Here's just to show how the rate of wind power exploitations have risen in the last 10 or 15 years. So it's dramatically exploitations have increased in the Sami areas. And I'm going to talk now about something that is really happening now. It's a British exploration company called Beowulf Mining that wants to open an iron ore mine in the middle of our reindeer herding community. If you saw the map, so here's where the proposed mine is located. And we had some protesters in 2013 when they did some test mining, and it got some international attention then. This case now is supposed to be decided. They said March, the government, but now we don't know with the current situation in the world. But I'm going to show you here something that is really eye-opening, because the mining company, they have been very fast to calculate how many % of our total area this mine will utilize, and it's not much. I mean, it's just a hole in the ground. But here is a picture from the mining company's EIA. They have the green line is a railroad, and it's really interesting because I never, in my world, the railroad is not green, it's red, because railroads, it's a big problem because trains run over reindeers. They don't understand that it's a threat. So in my book, it should be a red color. And these dotted red lines are proposed where they propose to build new railroads to transport the ore. Here is the same area in how I describe it, with the green as the grazing area, the blue as important grazing area, and the red is the most important grazing areas. And if I combine the two pictures here, you see that the proposed railroads and the most the best grazing areas. It coincides almost perfectly, and it's no coincidence, because you want to build a railroad where it's hard, solid ground, and that's the same areas where the best grazing areas. So with this simple picture, it's easy to explain that. I mean, it doesn't matter how many percent or promille the actual mine is when a lot of the infrastructure coincides with the most important grazing areas. And actually, the mine itself is just outside of my community. So in my community, it's actually 0%, but a lot of the most important areas are will be gone with this mine. And this is something that's happening right now. It's been a struggle for many years, but now we're on the finish line. And the UN, with the special rapporteurs of indigenous people, reached out to him, and they have written a statement saying this is wrong. We have a lot of environmental groups helping us, saying this is wrong, not just because it's potentially catastrophe for the Sami community and the Sami culture, but also it's iron ore. It's not something that is needed. As I said, Sweden is already producing 93% of Europe's iron ore, and it's also something that's not needed to lower carbon emissions. It's actually quite the opposite. Yeah, that's the last picture I had. So I'll stop sharing now.
So much, Jonas, for sharing all this information, and for also showing that, environmental defenders face different struggles in different places around the world, but it's not a problem which is limited to a few countries in the global south, but even in countries where we believe we have very high democratic standards, it's not necessarily the case that, for instance, indigenous groups are granted all their rights, or that we can always enjoy all our environmental rights. And thank you also for kind of sharing with us the challenges that we're facing, and that I believe that it will increase in the future when governments and businesses chase the resources that are needed for the green transition, and that's often the environmental burden to get these resources is disproportionately affecting certain groups and not everybody equally, as you have shown so very well for the case of Sweden. So thank you very much, Jonas, for being with us today and for sharing your work with us. So we will now go to a video message from David R. Boyd, the current UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. David wasn't able to join us live today, but he is sending us a video message. Unfortunately, our colleague from Mexico has not been able to join us at this point. Maybe she'll still join us later on. So we'll continue with the video from David once it's ready.
Hello, I'm Dr. David Boyd, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. We all know that we're in the midst of a global environmental crisis of unprecedented severity, and we urgently need more people to stand up and fight for the protection and restoration of the air, water, soil, biodiversity, and climate that we all depend upon. Ultimately, all of our human rights depend on a healthy planet. We need more defenders of the right to a healthy environment, indigenous rights, the rights of the child, and other human rights. And yet, in far too many states today, standing up for the environment, for clean water, clean air, healthy forests, healthy oceans, a safe climate, is a dangerous activity. The statistics are deeply disturbing, as we've heard. More than 200 documented murders of environmental human rights defenders every year. And this is just the tip of the iceberg of criminalization, violence, intimidation, and harassment. Women and girls are amazing environmental human rights defenders, but are particularly vulnerable. Surely this situation cannot continue. Doctors, nurses, and other frontline healthcare workers have been celebrated for their incredible courage and compassion during the terrible COVID-19 pandemic, and rightly so. But we should also celebrate and honor the incredible courage and dedication demonstrated day in, day out by environmental human rights defenders. We have the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. We have Human Rights Council Resolution 40/11 on environmental human rights defenders. We have a new regional treaty, the Escazú Agreement, with pioneering obligations on states to protect environmental human rights defenders. We have a new rapid response mechanism for environmental human rights defenders being established by parties to the Aarhus Convention. A growing number of states have national protection mechanisms to safeguard defenders. But none of these words are sufficient. They're tools, and tools need people to be useful, people with the knowledge, courage, and capacity to use them. What we urgently need is action to protect environmental human rights defenders who are at risk right now, a situation exacerbated by the pandemic, which has led to the weakening of environmental rules and enforcement in many states. We need the immediate implementation of existing protection mechanisms and the enforcement of existing laws. We need to use rights-based approaches to conservation, climate change, and preventing pollution. Evidence demonstrates conclusively that protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities produces positive environmental outcomes. We need governments to pass and implement laws recognizing the title and rights of Indigenous peoples, as well as legally guaranteeing their right to free, prior, and informed consent for activities being approved in their territories of life. We need to build capacity, reduce corruption, and strengthen the rule of law. When I speak to environmental human rights defenders, they often say that it's difficult for them to access help. They need help to build networks, to create connections with lawyers, scientists, funders, and other allies. There is definitely strength in numbers. They need help to harness the power of new digital tools. They need resources. We also need to prevent the socio-environmental conflicts that are really the root cause of the persecution of environmental human rights defenders. That means rapidly transforming our economies, replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy, replacing industrial agriculture with agroecology, and ending the exploitative mentality of extractivism. We also need a new legally binding treaty to govern the conduct of multinational corporations, because I can tell you that the UN guiding principles on business and human rights are nowhere near strong enough. Finally, we also need to put human rights at the heart of all conservation actions. Far too often, conservation actions have violated human rights, evicting people from their homes, criminalizing traditional lifestyles, and in extreme cases, beating, raping, and murdering Indigenous peoples and members of local communities simply for trying to exercise and defend their rights and their territories of life. These rights violations are found not only in the past, but sadly also in the present. And surely we can all agree that in the 21st century, this is completely unacceptable. In conclusion, we need to take action now to protect the heroic individuals and communities working so hard to protect this beautiful blue-green planet that we are all so lucky to call home. So in closing, I would like to extend my personal gratitude to all environmental human rights defenders for the vital work you are doing on behalf of your families, your communities, and humanity and the earth. Thank you very much.
Well, we're very grateful for David for having sent us this extremely powerful message, and also for addressing the wider systemic issues that allow for situations where human rights defenders are threatened, killed, and harassed on a daily basis. So we thank David for support for today's discussion. So we're now turning back to one of the speakers here with us in the room. We're very happy to have with us Daniel McGraw. He has had many roles, but he's amongst others President Emeritus of the Center for International Environmental Law, CIEL, one of our co-organizers in the event today, and a senior fellow with the School of Advanced International Studies at the Johns Hopkins University, and a very well-known expert of international environmental law and governance. So Daniel will talk to us about global level, UN level efforts to protect environmental defenders. The floor is yours, Daniel.
Thank you very much. It's hard to follow David Boyd sometimes. His passion and power are wonderful. The UN system is what I'm going to focus on here, and the UN system is complex, and so it's not surprising that activities with respect to environmental defenders occur across quite a few different agencies and at different levels. I want to start by mentioning a few aspects of that system before I turn to suggestions about how to improve it and how to get to the kind of action we need now that David Boyd referred to. Importantly, there's a clear mandate in the UN system to protect environmental defenders. The preamble and Article 1 of the UN Charter talk about human rights. So there's no question about the primacy of human rights. The UN Secretary General's call for action on human rights also mentions the environment, and it mentions human rights defenders. So again, from the SG level, we have that. David Boyd mentioned the Human Rights Council, the resolution on environmental human rights defenders, and also the declaration on human rights defenders. So there's plenty of mandate, and for an organization like the UN, that's important. Another important thing is we already have a strong pattern of collaboration between UNEP and OHCHR. And that's happened in spite of some countries not liking UNEP's involvement in that collaboration. But it's been very effective, and just one, I don't know if it's a major example, but it's an interesting one, is I think the first time we ever used that term, environmental human rights defender, was upstairs here. We had a program that featured, Sasha may remember it, an environmental human rights defender down in further away in Kenya, Phyllis Omida, and the UN Special Rapporteur on human rights defenders was here. John Knox, who was David Boyd's predecessor, a Special Rapporteur on human rights and environment, was here. And we realized that this was a major phenomenon. This was a major problem that focused to some degree on environmentalists, that ours is the most dangerous job. It's more dangerous than being a journalist or anything else, in fact. And so that's just an example. Again, it's minor, but this collaboration is very important, and I have no doubt that it will continue. A final point is to remember that the implementation of the UN activities happens primarily at the national and local levels through country offices and country teams, most of which are UNDP, UN Development Program. So again, we see that we need collaboration, we need the involvement, we need the commitment from across the UN system, and I'll come back to that idea. It's clear from what both David's told us and what you already know by yourselves probably, is the system is not doing enough right now, and we need to engage in future action. So one thing that's most obvious is we need more collaboration between different parts of the UN system. That includes not only UNDP, but also UN Women, as was pointed out. There's a gender-based discrimination even among environmental human rights defenders who are murdered. So UN Women has to become more involved, I think. The International Labour Organization, they're concerned about their workers, of course, and they are very well organized in certain ways. So that collaboration should be strengthened. With indigenous peoples groups, of course, the same thing, and there are other areas as well. The second step that needs to be taken is to increase the priority of protecting environmental defenders at these country office and country team levels. It's not just to tell them to do that, but they need the resources to do that as well, to work with the national governments and make this a real priority. Along the same lines is that we need to strengthen UNEP's environmental rule of law activities with respect to environmental defenders. And they need to increase the legal capacity at national levels and by extension at local levels, although UNEP often is not encouraged to work at local levels. But this has at least 4 aspects. One is jurisprudentially. We need each country to have a framework for what the country is expected to do, what the government is expected to do. Now we know this, it's not tricky. There was a case in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights back in 2009 that outlined a couple simple steps. One is that states need to protect environmental defenders when they're subject to any kind of threat. Again, these are not tricky. They're obvious, but a lot of countries don't have this kind of framework in place. The states have to refrain from placing hindrances, restrictions on the activities of environmental defenders. Again, fairly obvious. And then the third thing, which is totally breached, one thing that David didn't mention is that there are almost no prosecutions for those murders. On one hand, you can count the successful prosecutions over all those years. So what we need is a serious, effective investigations when there is a problem. And that includes actual prosecution at a high level of confidence. A second aspect of this strengthening that the UNEP's environmental rule of law program should do has to do with training judges. And UNEP already does a good job at this, but they need to improve. And specifically, once these frameworks are in place, or even before they are, because maybe it's the judges that put them in place, really educate judges about these steps. UNEP should promote the kinds of, I don't know if you heard a program earlier on environmental rights, but the kinds of policies and mechanisms that Peru has. And there are some countries that have very good systems or have aspects of good systems, and we need to identify those and promote them. And finally, something Jonas mentioned, it turns out when John Knox did his mapping exercise for the human rights system, he found that the human rights system requires environmental impact assessment. Not national legislation, but human rights institutions are doing that unanimously across the board. But why is that? Because we know now that environmental harm can affect human rights. And in order to figure that out, what kind of effects are likely, they have to do an environmental impact assessment, and it has to be really good. So the one he was talking about, they should have done that mapping that he did. Maybe they did and didn't want to put it in there, or maybe it's even, I don't know. But these environmental impact assessments really have to take into account human rights, and they have to be done really well. So a fourth major category is we need to work on the legal obligations of businesses. And David Boyden mentioned one aspect of this. It's not obvious how to do that. The UN guiding principles on business and human rights, I think, are woefully and obviously inaccurate. Just to remind you what they say, states have to respect, promote, and protect and fulfill human rights. Well, that's standard, nothing new there. When it comes to businesses, though, businesses don't have to do it. They should respect human rights. And you can argue with that. But even more amazingly, they don't even have to obey local and national laws. All they have to do is should, which is not mandatory in international legal parliaments. It's an extraordinary giveaway to businesses. And most of these people are being killed by businesses or governments, right? That's who's killing them. Carmen's not killing them. It's businesses or governments. And so we have to somehow get to these governments. So one way would be to help a little bit anyway, fix the guiding principles. Another is to think about this treaty that's being negotiated now on business and human rights. I'm not optimistic about it, but that process is underway. A third way is something like what the European Union is doing with its new due diligence approach. So there are ways of doing it, but it has to be done. And of course, a lot of that is just implementing local laws. Don't murder people, but it's more difficult than that. A fifth major thing, and Carmen mentioned this already, so I won't belabor it, but it is to work with Principle 10, strengthen the implementation of Principle 10, look to agreements like the SQZ, which specifically talk about environmental human rights defenders, use those approaches, use those mechanisms more broadly. The sixth one is to educate governments and businesses about the problems, about the dimension of this problem and the need to do things. I say both governments and businesses. I mean, education is not enough, but it can help. And using the doctrine or the concepts of environmental justice and the right to a healthy environment can be very important in that, and we shouldn't forget those. In this meeting, the United States is still opposing or doesn't want to mention the right to a healthy environment because it doesn't like it. Yeah, that's awful. So we got to work with governments too, obviously. It's not just education. And then finally, we need to intervene when it's needed. Now, Jonas pointed out that at least one limitation to the intervention. Who knows what's going to happen with this permit on the line. But I want to go to a story that happened here and then close. And this has to do with Phyllis Amito, the activist I mentioned earlier. Her partner's child was kidnapped. As you all know, there are other ways of intimidating people than killing. And nothing was happening. But John Knox, who was then the special rapporteur and the executive director of UNEP, contacted the president of Kenya and said, you know, your people know where this child is. You get him out of there and he should be safe. And that's what happened. Now, you can't have the executive director of UNEP on every time there's a problem. And sometimes you don't know about a problem until after it's happened. But some of these interventions are really critical. And we need to do them when they're necessary, even though they're not the real answer. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dan, also for a wealth of recommendations of things that can actually be done. So we have two more speakers before we come to the end of our event. So without further ado, I'll hand the floor to Georgina Lloyd. She's with the UN Environment Programme with the Regional Office for Asia and Pacific. And Georgina is going to speak about UNEP's work for environmental defenders. Georgina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And I also want to say thank you to Daniel for his comments on how we need to build and strengthen UNEP's work, because it is a very important area of work. And as Daniel mentioned, we do have a mandate, but specifically UNEP is mandated to lead the UN system in the development and implementation of environmental rule of law at all levels. And the promoting greater protection for EHRDs and advancing environmental rights, including those of Principle 10 rights, access to information, public participation, access to justice and environmental matters, is a fundamental part of UNEP's work to support this mandate. So in 2018, UNEP adopted an environmental defenders policy in response to the severe violations of environmental rights across the world that we've heard about throughout this session. And through this policy, UNEP recognizes that we cannot protect the environment without protecting those who are protecting the environment, those at the front lines of the environmental crises who are peacefully advocating for and supporting the implementation of environmental laws and upholding environmental rule of law. So under the policy, an email account has been set up, which is unenvironment-defenders@un.org, and I'll share that in the chat. But it's been set up to enable communities and individuals whose environmental rights have been violated or are in danger of being violated to contact UNEP directly and in confidence. Responses through this mechanism can include public statements, raising the profile of a case with media where appropriate, sending a letter to government to speak out on individual cases, and to point towards solutions in the form of technical and legal support to governments and other stakeholders, such as the judiciary, so that they can strengthen environmental rule of law and governance, which will mitigate environmental and human rights abuses. And you know, Daniel gave that very concrete example, and putting out public statements, and there have been other similar examples of the executive director putting out public statements that have addressed issues of violations of environmental rights through this policy. So specifically, the policy denounces attacks, torture, intimidation, and murders of environmental defenders, advocates for better protection of environmental rights for those who are standing up for these rights. It supports responsible and rights-based management of natural resources through strong institutions and environmental rule of law, and requests governments and companies accountability for different events where environmental defenders have been murdered or their rights have been violated. This particular policy also sits under the broader Environmental Rights Initiative that UNEP has. And the Environmental Rights Initiative is important because it covers a broader range of work that UNEP does, including judicial capacity building and technical legal assistance and those sorts of things. So the first pillar of this policy, of this initiative rather, is enhancing protection for EHRDs and expanding civic space. The second is integrating environmental rights, including the right to a healthy environment, into UN processes. And the third is enhancing states and other actors' abilities to promote and protect the human right to a healthy environment. These mandate of UNEP has been bolstered last year when member states endorsed UNEP's medium-term strategy for 2022 to 25, which does task UNEP to advance the human rights obligations relating to a clean, safe, healthy, and sustainable environment. And of course, as Daniel has mentioned, this is reinforced by the 2020 call to action for human rights, as well as the Human Rights Council resolution from last year recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So UNEP implements both its environmental defender policy and the Environmental Rights Initiative in close collaboration with its UN sister agencies, in particular UN Human Rights or OHCHR. And we seek to ensure greater protection and respect for fundamental human rights of EHRDs, in particular Indigenous women, Indigenous peoples, women, and youth. And so let me finish this very quick overview with some examples of implementation. The first is that UNEP supports a comprehensive information portal and training materials on environmental rights, and I'll put the link in the chat. We have built partnerships, not only with sister UN agencies, but with core organizations and networks, such as the Asia Pacific Network of Environmental Defenders, or APNED. We've also worked with civil society, such as Earthworks International and Not One More. We are supporting NHRIs to protect environmental rights together with the Asia Pacific Forum of NHRIs. And we've developed a training course on the role of NHRIs to uphold environmental rights. And that training program is available to everyone. And again, I'll share the link. In November of last year, we convened the inaugural Asia Pacific Environmental Human Rights Defender Forum, which provided a dedicated space for EHRDs to come together and safely discuss and learn from each other's experiences, and importantly, to formulate their own recommendations for positive change across the Asia Pacific region. And we're currently developing a publication collating these recommendations and guidance for member states and other actors to ensure the protection and promotion of the role of EHRDs. I also want to mention one other collaboration, because Daniel said how important this was, that we are working with UNDP, OHCHR, and UNICEF to advance children's rights to a healthy environment, particularly on climate justice for children and future generations. And lastly, of course, we have to provide direct policy and legal advice and technical legal assistance to member states to ensure that environmental rule of law is advanced and environmental rights are upheld. And we have developed a number of policy briefs in this area, but of course, a lot more needs to be done. So with that, thank you very much, Patricia, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Georgina, for sharing all of that information about UNEP's work with us. That was very helpful. Given we don't have a lot of time, let me just directly pass the floor to our last speaker, Yves Lador, who's with us, I think from Geneva. He's Earth Justice representative to UN in Geneva, and an expert on, amongst others, the Aarhus Convention. He will talk us through the new rapid response mechanism under the Aarhus Convention. Yves, over to you, and please keep it under 10 minutes because we'll...
Yes, hello. Thank you very much, Patricia, and a warm hello to everybody in Nairobi. I'm very happy and I want to thank you for having me. Very happy to participate to try to fill the gap between Geneva and Nairobi, which is quite needed. And of course, speaking after UNEP from here in Geneva, it's impossible not to do that without thinking about someone particular, which is Mrs. Niloufar Bayani, because Mrs. Niloufar Bayani was working with us here in Geneva. We met her actually just across the road here where I'm speaking. And she was working for UNEP and she refused to continue on a, she's just a brilliant lady and she refused to just do an international work. And she decided to go back in her country in order to serve her country and fight for environment issues, which are so important on the ground. And by doing that, she came into trouble and has been condemned and is right now servicing a 10 years prison sentence for the work she has been doing for the environment. And actually the way she has been accused, part of what she was accused for was exactly the work that she was doing in Geneva. So it shows even now when we're talking about environmental defenders, how people who are working for UNEP, implementing UNEP's mandate can be considered as a danger for some states. So it's very important that we have this in mind. And I once again want to thank what UNEP is doing in this field for the protection of environmental defenders. Now we have right now in all of the instruments that Dan Margot, and I really want to thank Dan for his presentation, has generally presented, and also what David Boyd has said, we do have a new mechanisms which has been decided a few months ago by the parties to what is called the Aarhus Convention. It's the equivalent to the ESCAZO. It's a bit older because it dates from 1998, and it is implementing in a legally binding way the Principle 10 of the Rio Convention. And there is in the Aarhus Convention, Article 3.8, which basically says that the very basic rights of people need to be respected for the convention to be efficient. Otherwise, there's no possibilities to have access to information, public participation, or access to justice in environmental matters if the very basic rule of law and human rights are not clearly respected. And of course, at the time of the drafting of the conference, nobody thought that in an area like us, and it's excellent that we heard from Jonas a bit earlier, that we might have issues of that sort. Unfortunately, this has come. We do have issues of environmental defenders in the Aarhus region. And because of that, the parties to the Aarhus Convention have decided to set up a new mechanism. Let's not forget that the Aarhus Convention has a very strong implementation committee to which anybody can have access. So it's one of the very efficient implementation mechanism. And in order to do that, they have, of course, a very long work in order to, get facts correct and have a clear discussion with the parties. And experience has shown that when you want to protect people, you need to act quickly. So in order to do that, the parties of the Aarhus Conventions have developed a rapid response mechanism. It's a decision taken at the last meeting of the parties, which sets this, and we will have now a special rapporteur for environmental defenders. The person is supposed to be nominated next June. The process is on its way right now. And the objective is to be able to protect people who are experiencing persecution or at imminent threat of persecution, penalization, or harassment. And what is very important in this new mechanism is just not to wait for things to happen. And I've been saying more than once, what we hope is that the report of this mechanism will be very short, that it will not have a lot of cases to complain where it was not possible to prevent such violation. This is why we have this new mechanism. This is why we want to have it as a preventive mechanism to act as quickly as possible. And the objective is that the special rapporteur is mandated by all of the parties of the convention to act toward a party where we would see such a situation and ask for immediate protection measures or ongoing protection measures if it's an issue that unfortunately is under a longer time frame. And then, of course, we hope that this dialogue will help prevent this. And then, of course, the special rapporteur will report to the meeting of the parties. And that's the report I was having in mind. We really hope that this report will be as short as possible. So this is a very concrete, very active decision that has been taken by the parties. As I said, the person will be nominated in June. So it's during this year that we will see how this will be organized and how it will be able to be correctly implemented. Now, just to finish and to say that what is interesting also with this mechanism, it is in a way an implementation of the resolution that was adopted by the Human Rights Council that was mentioned by the Special Rapporteur, the resolution 4011, that was adopted without a vote, which means a consensus of the Council, the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, saying, yes, we need to protect environmental defenders. They are bringing a very important contribution for the protection of the environment. And this effort was led by Norway in a very, very successful way. So in order to follow up, we have developed here with the Geneva University, a number of NGOs, and with the Geneva Environmental Network, a follow-up mechanism, which is called the Geneva Roadmap, in order to see how we can implement correctly this mechanism. I won't go too much in details into that, but it's very interesting to see that last year we had two major achievements. The achievement I just presented with the Aarhus Convention, but also in the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the first resolution on the protection of environmental defenders. It was a very moving moment at the last World Congress in Marseille, when all of the delegates stood up and you had a numbers of flowers on the table with the numbers of people who had been identified. And unfortunately, we know there's more than that, but the people who had been identified, environmental defenders who had lost their lives for their work for the environment. And there was a moment of silence, waving these flowers in the, in the name of these people. So I think this is a very important moment for the International Union of the Conservation of Nature. And later on the 9th, actually, of next month, you will have a discussion with a document and a report presented by the Geneva University on this development which has happened in the IUCN. So we do have some small, within the institutions, we do have a number of new steps which are done, progress. We need to continue this. We need to strengthen this. We really look forward for the first meeting of the parties to the Escazú Convention, a very important instrument for Latin America, as it was said by Carmen. We really look forward for that, Carmen, and we hope this will bring more. And just to finish, tomorrow, we will have at the Human Rights Council session, which has been opened today, a high-level segment organized by Sweden with a number of ministers who will take the floor in order to say, yes, we need to protect environmental defenders. So we're going to take these people by the word. We must make sure that the decision they take at the national level as well as the international level are very concrete steps for the protection of the environment. We have heard too many names, and there were just a few of people who have lost their life or simply are harassed or deterred to do the protection for the environment. And I think what David Boyd has said is so important. We need people to protect the environment. If we start targeting them, then we are really going in the wrong direction. I thank you very much. And I wish you all the best in Nairobi.
Thanks so much, Yves, for the update from the Aarhus level. Much appreciated. So we're running out of time. I have seen a very unfortunate message in the chat that just while we're speaking here, an environmental human rights defender in the Philippines got arrested. So we hope that she will be safe, and we hope that we can support the colleagues in making sure she is. So to wrap up, let me just extend my thank you to all the speakers. Thank you so much for sharing this wealth of information with us, either here in Nairobi in the room or digitally from around the world. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very happy that we had at some stage more than 70 people with us digitally, and around 30, 40 people here in the room. So at least 100 people participated to our meeting today. So many things have been said. My takeaway is that we can't stop talking about environmental defenders. We cannot forget them. We need to make sure that the information, the research that we've heard of today is shared. We need to advocate towards our governments to monitor the situation themselves. Even the most democratic countries do often not monitor the situation of environmental defenders. We need to make sure that those perpetrating their rights are prosecuted. We need to advocate for strengthening of UNEP's environmental rule of law program. We need also as environmental activists to fight for corporate accountability, corporate liability, for human rights due diligence. And whatever environmental issue we're concerned about, even if it's something very technical, a sectoral human rights issue, we all need to stand up for environmental rights, because without our fundamental human rights, none of the sectoral environmental agreements or domestic laws will ever be effective. So thank you very much for being with us today. And I wish you a very successful and peaceful UNEA. Thank you.